Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we are diving straight into a wonderfully layered piece of literature, Gregorio Lopez and Fuentes' classic story, A Letter to God. Now, you might know this as a standout piece from the CBSE Class English syllabus, but trust me, its themes, they are entirely universal. We're going to look at the fascinating, kind of humorous, and honestly tragic collision between absolute spiritual belief and human reality. We are going to break down exactly how the author crafts this narrative so you can truly grasp the mechanics of its brilliance. Let's kick things off with this profound quote. Hope remains persistent even when nature is unforgiving. I mean, that sets the dramatic stage perfectly, doesn't it? At its core, we're looking at what seems like a heartwarming tale about resilience after a natural disaster. But, as we'll soon see, that exact same persistent hope, it literally ends up causing a profound tragedy of human misunderstanding. To truly get the mechanics of this text, here is our agenda. 1. Faith, kindness, and irony. 2. Timeline of a tragedy. 3. Characters and their contrasts. 4. The author's literary toolkit. 5. Unpacking the core themes. And 6. Lessons for the real world. All right, jumping right in, Part 1, Faith, Kindness, and Irony, the rural setting and the core conflict. So, picture this. Imagine the incredibly moody, atmospheric setting of a rural cornfield just before disaster strikes. Our protagonist is a hardworking farmer, and his entire livelihood depends on the weather. When you picture those dark, brooding clouds rolling over a desperately needed harvest, you immediately feel that vulnerability, right? It's against this incredibly raw, natural backdrop that this whole paradox of faith versus perception unfolds. Okay, moving on to Part 2, Timeline of a Tragedy, following the plot from hope to irony. The way this story progresses is brilliant. It starts in Phase 1 with pure hope. Our farmer, Lencho, is eagerly waiting for rain to save his dry cornfield. But then, Phase 2 hits, bringing complete disaster when a severe hailstorm utterly destroys his entire harvest. Driven by pure desperation and this unwavering belief, we get to Phase 3. Lencho writes an actual letter addressed to God, asking for 100 pesos to survive. Wild, right? Well, in Phase 4, human empathy steps up. The local postmaster is so deeply moved by this pure faith that he collects charity from his own staff. Phase 5 is the shortfall. They try their absolute best, but they can only scrape together 70 pesos, which they mail back anonymously. And then, Phase 6, the irony. When Lencho counts the money, he doesn't feel grateful. Nope, he gets furious, suspects the post office employees of stealing the missing 30 pesos, and literally writes back to God to complain about them. I mean, talk about biting the hand that feeds you. Let's look at Part 3, Characters and their contrasts, the driving forces of the narrative. So, the entire crux of the story relies on the juxtaposition of our two main figures. On one side, we've got Lencho. He completely embodies absolute faith. He's honest, simple-hearted, and his optimism is incredibly strong. But it's also highly simplistic and very literal. On the flip side, we have the postmaster, who represents active compassion. He's this kind, amiable guy who selflessly decides to collect money completely anonymously just to preserve a total stranger's faith. These are our two opposing forces. You've got Lencho's blinding, vertical faith looking up to the sky, crashing straight into the postmaster's quiet, horizontal compassion operating right there on the ground. Which brings us to Part 4, the author's literary toolkit, how the story is built. Understanding the exact vocabulary the author uses is essential here. Words like crest and locusts vividly shape the harsh rural landscape and the very real physical threats our farmer is facing. Meanwhile, you have words like amiable and contentment establishing the emotional tone over at the post office. This vocabulary contrast is completely intentional. It mirrors the story's two distinct worlds, the harsh, unforgiving reality of the farm versus the warm, sheltered environment of the post office where the correspondence happens. Now look at how the author uses devastating expressions to deeply anchor us in Lencho's emotional despair. Take the phrase, turn to dust. When the hailstorm hits, his hopes don't just fade. They turn to dust. That is so visceral. It takes agricultural ruin and makes it intimately emotional, which really helps us empathize with the absolute desperation that drives him to write to the divine in the first place. The author's toolkit is incredibly precise. Early on, when the rain first starts, he uses a simile. The raindrops were like new coins, which directly equates the weather to financial survival. But when the hail hits, he flips to a metaphor, comparing the storm to a biological swarm. a plague of locusts, to illustrate total ruin. And then the masterstroke, situational irony. Lencho actually calls his generous, anonymous human saviors a bunch of crooks. It's this perfectly tragic, yet almost darkly comedic narrative climax. Okay, part 5. Unpacking the core themes, beyond the plot. These deeper themes intertwine so beautifully. We're dealing with hope, resilience, and human kindness. The post office workers literally act as divine instruments, humans functioning as the practical hands of God to answer prayers. But this brings us to the most complex subtheme, the blind spot of faith. The story reveals a fascinating, tragic reality. An unshakable, single-minded belief in something higher can actually create a cognitive bias, literally blinding a person to the real-world kindness happening right in front of their eyes. Because of these layered themes, the tone of the story is truly unique. The author masterfully balances a sympathetic tone toward the Vesperate farmer with a gentle, kind of curious mocking of his misconceptions. It instills a belief in humanity while simultaneously amusing us with the conflict. Ultimately, it leaves us in a deeply reflective mood about gratitude and how we perceive the help we get in our own lives. Finally, part 6, Lessons for the Real World, Applying the Text. This story brilliantly teaches us multiple lessons all at once. Yes, it validates that inner faith gives us the strength to navigate terrible tragedies, but it also teaches a profound lesson about giving. True compassion, like the postmaster's anonymous gift, doesn't need a public stage or a loud announcement. Furthermore, it's a stark warning against superficial judgments. It is incredibly easy to wildly misinterpret human efforts and intentions if we jump to conclusions too fast, exactly like Lencho did. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder. We've seen how Gregorio Lopez y Fuentes built this magnificent irony, but think about it practically. If you were in Lencho's shoes, completely blinded by your own absolute expectations, would you have recognized the miracle of human kindness right in front of you, or would you have only focused on what was missing? It's a brilliant question about perception, definitely something to keep in mind the next time life hands you 70 pesos when you asked for 100. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.